Every woman who had ever tried to capture Jang Taejin's attention ended up in tears. Not because he was intentionally cruel, though his silence could draw blood. Not because he was heartless, though the streets of Seoul whispered that his soul was carved from obsidian. But because the shadow sovereign of the Jang syndicate, the man who owned 30% of the city's skyline and 100% of its secrets, had never, in all his 32 years, looked at a woman with anything more than a glacial, empty indifference. His own father had once joked that Taejin was born with ice in his veins instead of blood. Boardrooms fell into a deathly hush when he entered. Men with decades of experience bowed their heads, afraid to catch the sharp, unreadable glint in his eyes. Beautiful women, heirs to fortunes, idols, and daughters of ministers, had been paraded before him at every gala and private dinner. And every single time, Taejin looked right through them, as if they were made of thin air. So when Amara Okoye, a 24-year-old intern from Nigeria with glowing brown skin and long, graceful braids, dropped an entire mountain of quarterly reports directly onto his custom-tailored Italian leather shoes, the world seemed to stop spinning. Amara didn't know the rules. She didn't know that the lobby of Jang Global was a cathedral of glass and steel, where nobody lingered and nobody dared to make a sound. She only knew that she was late, her hands were full, and the most devastatingly handsome man she'd ever seen was now wearing her financial spreadsheets on his toes. She looked up into those cold, dark eyes that usually made grown men tremble, and didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a frustrated huff and whispered, "Oh, you have got to be kidding me. These files are actually out for my soul today." Entire lobby went bone-chillingly silent. Security guards reached for their radios. Secretaries held their breath, waiting for the explosion. But Jang Taejin, the man who never stopped for anyone, the man whose expression hadn't shifted in a decade, simply stood there. He looked down at the paper-covered floor, then back at the girl in the bold red dress, and felt a sudden, violent crack in the ice around his heart. For the first time in his life, he didn't walk away. He reached down. Before we continue, if you enjoy dangerous love, power, and secrets that could destroy everything, hit subscribe now, because this story only gets darker. The lobby of Jang Global Industries was more than just a grand entrance. It was a cathedral of power where the air felt heavy with the weight of billion-dollar decisions and unspoken threats. The floor was a vast expanse of white marble, polished to such a mirror-like finish that the reflection of the towering ceiling lights looked like fallen stars. Employees moved in synchronized, hurried patterns, their heels clicking against the stone in a rhythm of collective anxiety. In this building, silence wasn't just requested. It was the law. Jang Taejin moved through the center of the hall like a predator through tall grass. His broad shoulders were squared beneath a charcoal gray suit that fit him with surgical precision. Behind him, 3 men in identical black suits followed at a respectful distance, their eyes scanning the crowd with professional coldness. Taejin didn't look left or right. He didn't need to. He knew the room belonged to him. Then came the sound that shouldn't have existed. It was the frantic sliding of paper and the heavy thud of cardboard hitting the marble. Taejin stopped. He didn't just slow down. He came to a complete, abrupt halt, because something had caught the tip of his shoe, and a flurry of white documents was now fanning out across his polished black Oxfords like a deck of cards. Amara Okoye was on her knees before she even realized whose path she had blocked. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic. It was her first day, her first hour, and she had already managed to stumble. Her long, dark braids swept over her shoulders as she scrambled to gather the scattered quarterly reports. She was wearing a red dress, a bold choice for a place so gray, and in the sea of monochrome suits, she looked like a flame flickering in a tomb. "I am so sorry," she murmured, her voice breathless but steady. "I think the elevator was trying to sabotage me." She reached out to grab a stray folder that had slid particularly far, her fingers brushing the edge of an expensive trouser leg. That was the moment the lobby died. The receptionists froze with their hands over their phones. The security guards went rigid. To touch Jang Taejin, even accidentally, was to court disaster. Amara looked up. She expected to see a frustrated businessman or an annoyed executive. Instead, she found herself staring into a face that looked like it had been carved from cold stone. His features were sharp, his jawline defined with a lethal edge, and his eyes were a dark, bottomless void that seemed to swallow the light. For 10 years, Taejin had lived behind a wall of absolute detachment. Women were puzzles he didn't care to solve, distractions he didn't permit. But as he looked down at the girl on the floor, he didn't see the usual fear. He didn't see the calculated flirting of the socialites or the trembling terror of his subordinates. He saw a pair of honey-brown eyes that were wide with genuine embarrassment, but underpinned by a strange, quiet strength. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar jolt in his chest, a physical sensation of something heavy shifting. It was as if a gear that had been rusted shut for a decade had suddenly groaned into motion. His lead bodyguard, a man named Min-ho, stepped forward with a darkened expression. "Miss, do you have any idea?" Min-ho. Name was spoken softly, but it acted like a physical barrier. The bodyguard stopped instantly, his mouth snapping shut. Taejin didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the crowd of onlookers who were now watching the scene with morbid fascination. He kept his gaze locked on Amara. The silence stretched, becoming so thin it felt like it might snap. Then, slowly, the most powerful man in the city did something that defied every rumor ever told about him. He reached down, his large, calloused hand, marked with the subtle, dark ink of a tattoo peeking from beneath his white cuff, extended toward her. Amara stared at his hand for a heartbeat before tentatively placing her own in his. His grip was firm and warm, a startling contrast to the icy aura he projected. He pulled her to her feet with effortless grace. As she stood, she found she was tall, but he still towered over her, his presence wrapping around her like a physical weight. Up close, she could smell him, scents of expensive cedarwood, sharp espresso, and something dangerous. "Are you okay?" he asked. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of an explosion. A woman at the reception desk actually dropped her pen. In 10 years, no one had heard Jang Taejin offer a word of concern to anyone, let alone a stranger, and certainly not a woman. His voice was a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to settle right in the center of Amara's bones. Amara blinked, clearing the daze from her head. She smoothed down her red dress and clutched the recovered files to her chest. "I'm fine. My pride is a little bruised, but the papers survived." She offered him a small, sheepish smile. "Thank you, I'm Amara. I'm the new intern in finance." Taejin didn't smile back, but his eyes didn't leave her face. He noted the way the light caught the golden undertones of her skin and the way she stood her ground even as his security detail loomed behind him. She wasn't bowing. She wasn't trembling. She was just looking at him like he was a man. "Amara," he repeated. The way he said her name made it sound like a secret. He stayed there for a second too long, a second that broke every rule of his disciplined life. He should have walked away. He should have let his assistants handle the mess. But he found himself anchored to the spot by the sheer, radiant warmth she emitted. Finally, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Without another word, he turned and continued toward the private elevators, his stride as controlled as ever. But as the gold-plated doors closed and he caught his reflection in the polished metal, Taejin realized his hand was still tingling. Down in the lobby, Amara stood watching the elevator floor numbers climb. She felt a lingering heat where his skin had touched hers. She didn't know that she had just survived a meeting with a man most people called a monster. She only knew that for a brief moment, the coldest room in Seoul had felt incredibly, inexplicably warm. The 14th floor of Jang Global Industries was a high-pressure engine room where the air was thick with the scent of toner, expensive espresso, and the quiet desperation of junior analysts trying to survive the day. Unlike the silent majesty of the lobby, this floor hummed with a frantic energy. Computers whirred, phones buzzed on vibrate, and the click of keyboards sounded like distant rain. Amara sat at a small, cramped desk tucked into a corner that the morning sun barely reached. After the encounter in the lobby, her heart had finally slowed down, but the atmosphere on the 14th floor was doing its best to kick it back into overdrive. Her supervisor, a woman named Ms. Choi with a bob so sharp it looked like it could cut paper, had barely looked up from her screen when Amara arrived. She had simply pointed to a stack of digital ledgers that needed reconciling by noon. Amara leaned into the work, her fingers moving across the keypad with a steady rhythm. She was used to being the underdog, used to the cold glances from colleagues who wondered how an outsider from Chicago had landed a spot in the city's most prestigious firm. She kept her head down, her braids tied back neatly, focusing on the numbers. But every time the heavy glass doors at the end of the hall swung open, she found herself glancing up, half expecting to see a pair of dark, unreadable eyes. 60 floors above, the world was very different. Jang Taejin sat behind a desk made of dark, polished obsidian that looked out over the sprawling Seoul skyline. The city looked small from here, a collection of toy buildings and silver threads of traffic. Usually, this view gave him a sense of absolute control, but today his focus was fractured. The silence of his office, which he normally cherished, felt heavy. He could still feel the phantom sensation of a soft, warm hand in his, a contrast so sharp to his usual life that it felt like a bruise. He pressed a button on his desk intercom. Within seconds, his head of security, Minho, entered the room. Minho was a man of few words, a shadow who had been at Taejin's side through the bloodiest years of the syndicate's transition into a legitimate empire. He stood at attention, sensing the unusual tension in the room. "Girl in the lobby," Taejin said. His voice was a low, velvet rasp. He didn't need to specify which girl. In 10 years, there had only been one who had caused him to stop. "I want everything, not just the HR file. I want to know where she eats, who she speaks to, and why she ended up in my building." Minho nodded, his expression unchanging. "She is Amara Okoye. She arrived from Chicago 3 weeks ago on a high-achievement scholarship. Her background is clean, sir. No ties to the rival families, no history of corporate espionage. She lives in a small apartment in Mapo." "That isn't enough," Taejin interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the horizon. "I want to know the things a paper trail doesn't show. I want to know why she isn't afraid of me." As Minho withdrew to execute the order, Taejin leaned back in his leather chair. He was a man who dealt in calculated risks and strategic moves. He didn't believe in coincidences, and yet there was no logical reason for him to be thinking about an intern. He told himself it was a security precaution. A girl like that, so vibrant and out of place, could be a weapon used by his enemies. But deep down, in a part of himself he had kept locked away since his father's funeral, he knew that wasn't the truth. He was haunted by the scent she had left behind, a mix of shea butter and something warm, like sunlight on skin. It was a smell that didn't belong in a cathedral of glass and steel. Back on the 14th floor, the afternoon was becoming a trial by fire. Amara was heading toward the break room when she was cut off by 2 senior analysts. They were tall, polished men who wore their arrogance like a uniform. "Lobby favorite," one of them said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We heard the chairman actually touched your hand. Tell us, do you always use such clumsy tactics to get noticed, or was that a special performance for the first day?" Amara stopped, clutching her coffee mug. She felt the heat rising in her neck, but she didn't look down. She remembered the weight of Taejin's hand and the way he had silenced his own bodyguard with a single word. If a man like that could show her a moment of civility, she wasn't going to let these two make her feel small. "I think if I wanted to perform, I'd choose a better stage than a marble floor," Amara replied, her voice calm and clear. "Now, if y'all excuse me, I have 3 more ledgers to finish before Ms. Choi loses her patience." She walked past them, her heart thumping against her ribs. She could feel their eyes on her back, resentful and sharp. The corporate world of Jang Global was just as dangerous as any street, only the weapons were different. Here, People used whispers and shadows to tear you down. She sat back at her desk, staring at the blue light of the monitor until the numbers blurred. She felt incredibly alone in this vast, cold building. She pulled a small tin of shea butter from her bag and rubbed a bit into her cuticles, the familiar scent providing a momentary sense of home. She didn't notice the subtle movement of a security camera in the corner of the ceiling, adjusting its lens to focus directly on her. Miles away, in a darkened room, a screen flickered to life. Taejin watched the high-definition feed of the small corner desk on the 14th floor. He watched Amara work, watched the way she tucked a stray braid behind her ear, and watched her quiet defiance against the analysts. He saw the moment she used the shea butter, her eyes closing for a brief second as she took a breath. He realized then that he wasn't looking for a threat. He was looking for a reason to stay interested in a world that had grown gray and lifeless. He watched her until the sun began to set over Seoul, casting long, orange shadows across her desk. He was the most powerful man in the city, but as he watched the screen, he felt like a man standing outside in the cold, looking through a window at a fire he wasn't allowed to touch. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark, the silence of the office finally feeling like a cage. The week following the incident in the lobby was a blur of spreadsheets and cold shoulders for Amara. She had expected to be fired, or perhaps reassigned to a basement office where no one would ever see her again. Instead, she found herself working late on a rainy Tuesday evening, the only one left in the finance department as the city lights began to shimmer through the glass. Her desk was illuminated by a single lamp when a man she recognized from the security detail appeared silently beside her. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a heavy, matte black envelope on her keyboard and vanished back into the shadows of the hallway. Amara picked up the envelope, her fingers tracing the weight of the paper. It was sealed with a thick dollop of gold wax, stamped with a crest she didn't recognize, a stylized tiger entwined with a blade. There was no name on the outside, but she knew who it was from. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she broke the seal. Inside was a single card with a time and a floor number. 65, the very top of the building. The elevator ride felt like it lasted a lifetime. As the numbers climbed, the air seemed to grow thinner and colder. When the doors finally slid open on the 65th floor, she didn't find an office. Instead, she stepped out into a sprawling rooftop garden. It was a hidden paradise of manicured pines, trickling stone fountains, and exotic flowers that bloomed even in the crisp Seoul air. City noise was muffled here, replaced by the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Jang Taejin was standing at the edge of the roof, his back to her. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate tattoos that coiled around his forearms like living shadows. He was looking out over the Han River, a glass of amber liquid in one hand. "You came," he said, without turning around. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floor and into her heels. "I wasn't sure if it was an invitation or a summons," Amara replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly on the stone path. Taejin turned then, and the sight of him in the moonlight was almost overwhelming. The sharp lines of his face were softened by the shadows, but his eyes remained as intense as ever. He watched her approach, his gaze moving from her braids down to the simple dress she wore. He looked like a man who was fighting a war within himself. "It was neither," he said, stepping away from the ledge. "It was a warning." Amara stopped a few feet away from him. The scent of cedarwood and rain was stronger here. "A warning about what? My filing skills. I promise I've been much more careful since Tuesday." Taejin didn't smile. He stepped closer, entering her personal space until she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "The people in this building talk. The people in this city watch. By stopping for you in that lobby, I put a target on your back that you are too innocent to see." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek before he pulled back, as if remembering himself. "You are an intern from Chicago with a bright future. You have a family who expects you to come home. My life is not measured in years or career goals. It is measured in debts, blood, and the kind of secrets that bury people. I'm not as fragile as you think, Mr. Jang, Amara said softly. I grew up in a neighborhood where you had to know which streets to walk on and which ones to avoid. I chose to come here. I chose to work for you. You chose to work for a corporation, Taejin corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You didn't choose the man who runs the shadows beneath it. There are men in this city who would hurt you just to see if I would blink. There are women who would ruin your reputation just because I spoke your name. My world is a beautiful cage, Amara. If you stay close to me, the bars will close around you too. Air between them felt electric, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the height of the building. Amara could see the pulse jumping in his neck. For a man who claimed to be made of ice, he was radiating a heat that made her dizzy. Why are you telling me this? She asked. If you wanted me gone, you could have just had me transferred. Why bring me up here to the top of the world just to tell me to stay away? Taejin stayed silent for a long moment, the wind tossing a lock of dark hair across his forehead. He looked at her with a raw honesty that shattered the shadow sovereign persona he wore for the rest of the world. Because for 10 years, I haven't felt a single thing, he confessed. And then you dropped those files and you looked at me like I was a person, not a boss. Not a monster, just a man. I brought you here because I wanted to see if the feeling was real or if I had finally gone mad. He reached out again, and this time he didn't pull away. His thumb brushed against the line of her jaw, his skin rough and warm. Amara leaned into the touch instinctively, her eyes fluttering shut. The warning had been delivered, the danger had been explained, but as his hand cradled her face, the logic of the world seemed to fall away. Go home, Amara, he whispered, even as he stepped closer, his breath ghosting over her lips. Forget about the lobby, forget about the rooftop. Stay in the light where you belong. That an order? She asked, her voice barely audible. Taejin's eyes darkened, a flash of something possessive and hungry crossing his features. No, it's a plea. He pulled his hand away abruptly and turned back to the city, his posture returning to the rigid, untouchable stance he was known for. The interview was over. Amara stood in the silence of the garden for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of everything he hadn't said. She turned and walked back to the elevator, but as the doors closed, she knew she wasn't going to listen. The light was safe, but the shadows were where he was, and she had never been afraid of the dark. The following weeks were defined by a double life that felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. In the daylight, Amara remained the quiet, diligent intern on the 14th floor, her interactions with the upper echelons of Jang Global restricted to professional emails and brief glimpses of black sedans arriving in the basement. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the city of Seoul transformed into a sea of neon, her world became a series of digital whispers. It began with a single text message from an unsaved number. Are you home safely? Asterisk from that night on, the silence of Amara's small apartment was filled with the rhythmic glow of her phone screen. Taejin was a man of few words in person, but in the anonymity of the night, he began to peel back the layers of the armor he had worn for a decade. Their conversations weren't about corporate strategy or power. They were about the small, human things that Taejin had long ago forgotten. He told her about the suffocating weight of expectation, how he had been groomed from childhood to be a weapon rather than a son. Amara, in turn, told him about the vibrant chaos of her family in Chicago, the smell of her mother's cooking, and the terrifying leap of faith it took to move across the world for a dream she wasn't sure she could achieve. She sent him photos of the street food she tried in Mapo, and he would reply with brief, uncharacteristically honest comments about how he hadn't walked a public street in years. As the days bled into one another, the digital connection turned into physical stolen moments. They found pockets of time that didn't exist on any official calendar. Sometimes it was a 20-minute meeting in a darkened corner of the building's private library at 9:00 p.m. Other times, it was a silent drive in the back of his armored car, the glass tinted so dark the world outside couldn't see the shadow sovereign holding the hand of an intern. One rainy Thursday, they sat in the back of that car, parked on a secluded overlook facing the river. The raindrops raced down the windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and blue. Taejin was unusually quiet, his thumb tracing the knuckles of Amara's hand. The air in the car was warm and smelled of his cedarwood cologne and her vanilla oil. "My father didn't die of a heart attack," Taejin said suddenly. The words were heavy, landing in the quiet cabin like stones in a pool of water. It was the first time he had spoken of the event that had forced him onto the throne at 22. Amara didn't move. She didn't gasp or offer hollow sympathy. She simply tightened her grip on his hand, giving him the space to continue. "He was murdered in front of me," he whispered, his voice sounding raw and stripped of its usual authority. "We were at a dinner, a celebration of a merger. He took one sip of his wine and collapsed. The men who did it were people he had trusted for 20 years, people he had called brothers." He turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she saw the ghost of the boy who had watched his world shatter. "That was the day I realized that trust is a luxury I couldn't afford." I spent the next 5 years systematically removing every person who had a hand in it. I thought that by making myself untouchable, I would finally be safe. But I only succeeded in making myself a ghost. "You aren't a ghost to me, Taejin," Amara said softly. She reached up, her fingers brushing the hair away from his forehead. "A ghost doesn't have a heart that beats this fast when I'm near. A ghost doesn't worry about an intern's safety." Taejin leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. "I told myself I was keeping you around to protect you, but the truth is, I am selfish. I'm addicted to the way you look at me. It's the only time I feel like I am actually standing in the light." He pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her waist. In the confined space of the car, the danger of their situation felt both miles away and right outside the door. He began to tell her more. The names of the flowers his mother loved, the way the cold felt in the mountains where he was sent for training, and the deep, aching loneliness that had become his only constant companion until a stack of files hit his shoes. They shared secrets that could destroy him if the wrong ears heard them. He told her about the internal friction within the syndicate, the elders who thought he had grown too soft by focusing on legitimate business, and the constant pressure to marry into a rival family to cement a peace treaty. "They want me to marry Shin Yona," he admitted, his face tightening. "It would end a 30-year feud. It's what my advisors call a perfect move." "What do you call it?" Amara asked, her heart sinking. Taejin pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. The coldness was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying clarity. "I call it a prison sentence. I spent 10 years doing what was expected of me. I won't give them my life, too." He leaned in, his lips lingering just a breath away from hers. "Every moment I spend with you is a theft. I'm stealing time from a life that belongs to the Empire, and I don't regret a single second of it." When he finally kissed her, it wasn't the tentative, careful touch from the rooftop. It was desperate and deep, a silent promise made in the dark. Amara felt the world outside, the office politics, the looming threats, and the vast cultural divide, dissolve into nothing. There was only the sound of the rain on the roof and the heat of a man who was finally, after a decade of winter, beginning to thaw. As she climbed out of the car later that night near her apartment, watching the red taillights disappear into the mist, Amara knew they had passed the point of no return. They were no longer just a boss and an intern. They were two people holding on to a secret that was becoming too large to hide, and in his world, secrets were the most dangerous things of all. The fragile bubble of peace Amara and Taejin had constructed over the late-night texts and shared secrets didn't just burst. It was systematically dismantled. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the heavy atmosphere of the 14th floor was pierced by a presence that made even the most arrogant analysts stop mid-sentence. Shin Yona didn't walk into a room. She colonized it. As the only daughter of the Shin syndicate, her reputation preceded her like a cold front. She was dressed in a crimson silk suit that looked like a fresh wound against the sterile white of the office. Her heels clicked with the precision of a metronome as she bypassed the reception desk without a glance, her eyes scanning the sea of cubicles with visible disdain. She stopped at the edge of the finance department, her gaze landing directly on the corner desk where Amara sat. Amara felt the shift in the room before she saw the woman. The air seemed to lose its warmth. She looked up from her monitor to find a woman with hair like spun silk and eyes that held the terrifying sharpness of a diamond. Said, her voice a melodic, dangerous purr that carried across the quiet floor. "This is the little shadow everyone is whispering about." Amara stood up slowly, her braids falling over her shoulder as she met the woman's gaze. She didn't know who this was, but she recognized the aura of inherited power. It was the same weight Taejin carried, but without the flicker of humanity he showed in the dark. "Can I help you with something?" Amara asked, her voice calm. Yona laughed, a short, brittle sound. She stepped closer, invading Amara's space until the scent of her cloying, expensive perfume overwhelmed the faint smell of shea butter. "I don't think you can help me with anything, darling. I'm here to see the man who belongs to me." Before Amara could respond, the elevator at the end of the hall chimed. Taejin stepped out, flanked by Minho. His face was a mask of absolute indifference, but the way his jaw tightened when he saw Yona standing at Amara's desk told a different story. The entire floor held its breath. "Yona," Taejin said, his voice a low warning. "My office is 60 floors up. What are you doing down here?" Yona turned, a predatory smile spreading across her lips. She glided toward him, her movements fluid and practiced. "I grew tired of waiting for your return calls, Taejin." And then I heard a fascinating rumor that the Ice King had finally melted. I wanted to see the flame that was responsible. She cast a sharp, sideways glance back at Amara. I expected something more substantial. Taejin didn't look at Amara, he couldn't. He knew that even a flicker of concern would be a weapon Yona would use to destroy her. "We have nothing to discuss," he said, his tone flat. "We have everything to discuss," Yona countered, her voice dropping but losing none of its edge. "My father is losing patience. The elders in your own family are tired of your modernization projects. They want stability, they want the merger, and they want the wedding date set before the end of the quarter." She reached out, her gloved hand resting on Taejin's lapel. "You can play with your little intern in the shadows, Taejin. I don't care about your distractions, but don't forget who you are. You are the shadow sovereign, and I am the only woman in this city who can sit on that throne beside you." Political marriage isn't a suggestion anymore, it's a requirement. Amara stood frozen at her desk. The words felt like physical blows. She looked at Taejin, searching for the man who had held her hand in the car, the man who had whispered about his father's murder. But he was gone. In his place was a stranger in a charcoal suit, his eyes as dark and unreadable as the night they first met. "Minho," Taejin said, his voice cold enough to frost the glass walls. "Escort Ms. Shin to my private office." "I will be up shortly." Yona leaned in, whispering something into Taejin's ear that made his eyes flash with a momentary, violent light. She then turned back to Amara, offering a small, mocking wave of her fingers. "It was lovely to meet you, Amara. Enjoy the 14th floor. It's as high as y'all ever go." As Yona disappeared into the elevator with a triumphant click of her heels, the silence on the floor became unbearable. Every eye was on Amara. The senior analysts who had mocked her before were now wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. Taejin stood at the end of the hallway for a heartbeat. He looked in Amara's direction, but his gaze seemed to pass through her, as if she truly were made of glass. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't defend her. He simply turned and followed Yona into the elevator. Amara sat back down, her hands shaking so violently she had to hide them beneath the desk. The numbers on her screen were a blur. She realized then that the warning Taejin had given her on the rooftop wasn't just a dramatic gesture. The cage was closing, and the bars were made of the very traditions and blood debts he had tried to escape. She looked at her phone, waiting for a text that didn't come. The digital whispers were silent. The sun was still high in the sky, but for Amara, The winter Taejin had described had finally arrived. She wasn't just an intern anymore. She was a variable in a high-stakes war, and for the first time since arriving in Seoul, she felt the true, terrifying weight of the man she had allowed herself to love. The rainy season in Seoul had arrived in earnest, turning the vibrant streets of Itaewon into a blur of neon reflections and slick asphalt. Amara walked quickly, her umbrella tilted against the wind. Since the confrontation with Yona on the 14th floor, the silence from Taejin had been absolute. No texts, no midnight drives, no secret smiles in the lobby. She felt like a ghost haunting the halls of Jang Global, a distraction that had been efficiently neutralized. She had come to Itaewon to lose herself in the crowd, hopping the smell of street food, and the noise of the international district would drown out the hollow ache in her chest. But as she turned into a narrower alleyway to take a shortcut toward the subway station, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The usual bustle of the main road faded, replaced by a heavy, unnatural quiet. Black sedan with tinted windows was idling at the end of the alley, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. Amara slowed her pace, her heart beginning a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to head back toward the main street, but her path was blocked. 3 men in dark, nondescript jackets stepped out from the shadows of a closed storefront. They didn't look like corporate security. They had the hard, jagged edges of men who were comfortable with violence. MS. Okoye, the man in the center said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any politeness. Our lady would like a word with you, somewhere more private. Amara backed away, her grip tightening on her umbrella. I don't know who your lady is, and I have nothing to say to her. It wasn't a request, the man replied, stepping forward. Just as the man reached out to grab her arm, the screech of tires echoed through the narrow space. A silver SUV swerved into the alley, missing the black sedan by inches. The doors flew open before the vehicle had even come to a full stop. Minho and 3 other guards Amara recognized from the lobby charged out, their movements disciplined and lethal. They didn't hesitate. In seconds, the alley was a blur of muffled strikes and the sound of bodies hitting the wet pavement. It wasn't a fight. It was a professional extraction. Minho moved with a terrifying efficiency, neutralizing the man who had approached Amara with a single, brutal blow to the throat. In the car, Ms. Okoye, Minho commanded, his voice tight. Amara scrambled into the back seat of the SUV, her breath coming in jagged gasps. She expected to be alone, but as the door clicked shut and the vehicle sped away, she realized she wasn't. Jang Taejin was sitting in the corner, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He looked different than he had in the office. He had traded his tailored suit for a black tactical jacket, and his hair was wind-blown and messy. On the seat beside him lay a sleek, matte black handgun and a radio that hummed with static. The CEO persona had been completely stripped away, leaving behind the raw, dangerous reality of the Shadow Sovereign. Taejin, she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Amara saw the full extent of the darkness he had tried to hide. His eyes weren't just cold, they were predatory. The subtle tattoos on his hands seemed more prominent in the dim light of the car, and there was a smudge of someone else's blood on his cuff. I told you the bars would close, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Yona didn't waste any time. Those weren't just thugs, they were the Shin family's elite. If my men hadn't been tailing you, you'd be on a boat to Jeju by now. You were following me? Amara asked, a mix of relief and horror washing over her. Never stopped watching you, Amara, he confessed, leaning forward into the light. The anger in his expression was directed at the world, but his touch, as he reached out to check her face for injuries, was surprisingly gentle. I tried to push you away to keep you out of this. I thought if I ignored you, they would think I didn't care. I was wrong. My silence only made you an easier target. He picked up the handgun and checked the magazine with a practiced, chilling familiarity. Amara stared at the weapon, the reality of his life finally crashing down on her. This wasn't a corporate drama. This was a war. Who are you, really? she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Taejin looked her in the eyes, refusing to look away from the truth. I am the man who keeps the peace in this city by being more dangerous than the people who want to break it. I am the head of the Jang Syndicate. Everything you see in the skyline is the skin. What you saw in that alley, that is the bone. He saw the fear in her eyes and felt a sharp twist of regret in his chest. He wanted to apologize, to tell her he could make it go away, but he couldn't lie to her anymore. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who was willing to burn the city down to keep her safe. You can't go back to your apartment, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You can't go back to the 14th floor. From this moment on, you stay with me. My house, my security, my world. It's the only way you stay alive. What about the merger? What about Yona? Amara asked. Taejin's jaw set into a hard, lethal line. Yona made a mistake. She thought she could use you to force my hand. Instead, she just gave me a reason to stop playing by the rules. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His grip was possessive, a silent vow of protection that felt like both a sanctuary and a sentence. As the SUV climbed the winding roads toward his private estate, Amara looked out at the rain-soaked city. She had started the day as an intern with a dream of a career in finance. She was ending it as the protected prize of a Mafia boss, deep in the shadows where the rules of the world no longer applied. She looked at Taejin, the man she loved and the monster he had to be, and realized that for better or worse, her old life was over. The safe house on the outskirts of Seoul was a brutalist structure of concrete and reinforced glass, hidden deep within a forest of pine trees. Inside, the air was sterile and quiet, but for Taejin, the silence was deafening. He stood in a high-tech surveillance room, the blue light of a dozen monitors reflecting in his eyes. Amara was upstairs, finally asleep under the watchful eye of his most trusted female guards, but Taejin knew he couldn't rest. Not while the rot remained inside his own house. The failed abduction in Itaewon had confirmed his worst fear. The Shin family wasn't just guessing his movements, they were being guided. Someone had provided them with Amara's schedule, her exact location, and the specific window of time when his security rotation was at its thinnest. Minho entered the room, his expression even more grim than usual. The trackers are set, sir. The digital breadcrumbs have been laid. Taejin nodded, his jaw tight. And the targets. Only 3 people received the specific location of the emergency meeting tonight, Minho reported. Your head of logistics, the lead counsel, and your cousin, Hyen Woo. Taejin felt a cold, familiar ache in his chest. Hyen Woo was more than just a cousin. They had grown up together in the shadow of their father's legacies. They had shared meals, secrets, and the heavy burden of the Jang name. To suspect him was to admit that the last remnant of Taejin's family was a lie. We wait, Taejin whispered. The trap was simple but lethal in its precision. Taejin had leaked a different, secure location to each of the 3 suspects, a place where Amara was supposedly being moved for her safety. If the Shin family showed up at one of those locations, the mole would be exposed. For 3 hours, Taejin didn't move. He watched the screens with a predatory patience. At 2:14 a.m., a cluster of black vehicles appeared on the thermal feed of an abandoned warehouse in Gyeonggi-do. It was the location he had given only to Hyen Woo. Taejin didn't yell. He didn't smash anything. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. When he opened them, the last shred of the Ice King had returned, harder and colder than before. Bring him to the study, Taejin commanded. The study in the safe house was a room designed for difficult conversations. It was lined with dark wood and heavy leather, the only light coming from a single lamp on the desk. When Hyen Woo was brought in, he looked disheveled, his eyes darting around the room with a nervous energy he couldn't quite hide. Taejin, what is this? Woo asked, trying for a tone of offended innocence. Minho dragged me out of bed like a criminal. We're family. Taejin sat behind the desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He looked at his cousin and saw a stranger. Family doesn't sell blood to the highest bidder, Woo. Family doesn't put a target on a woman's back because they're greedy for a throne they haven't earned. Color drained from Wu's face. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as Taejin turned a laptop screen toward him. It showed the live feed of the Shin family's men being surrounded and neutralized at the Gyeonggi-do warehouse. "I gave you that location an hour before the cars arrived," Taejin said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. "I wanted to believe it was anyone else. I wanted to believe that the boy I grew up with still existed, but you traded my father's legacy and Amara's life for a seat at Yona's table." Wu's facade crumbled. He sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. "You were changing everything, Taejin. You were turning us into a legitimate shipping company. We were kings of the underground, and you wanted us to be accountants. The Shin family promised to keep the old ways. They promised me I wouldn't be just a shadow in your wake. The old ways killed my father," Taejin snapped, his voice finally rising with a controlled fury. "And they would have killed her. You didn't do this for the syndicate. You did it because you're a coward who couldn't lead, so you chose to serve my enemy instead." Taejin stood up and walked around the desk. He leaned in close, his presence overwhelming the smaller man. "I should end this right here. Every law of our world says you don't walk out of this room." Wu looked up, tears of terror welling in his eyes. "Taejin, please, we're blood." "That is the only reason you are still breathing," Taejin said, his voice dropping back to a whisper. "But you are no longer a Jang. I'm stripping you of your name, your assets, and your protection. You have 1 hour to leave the country. If I ever see your face in Korea again, or if you even think of contacting Yona, I will forget we ever shared a name." He signaled to Minho, who stepped forward and hauled Wu to his feet. As they dragged him toward the door, Wu began to sob, pleading for a mercy he hadn't shown Amara. When the door clicked shut, Taejin stayed in the darkness of the study. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion. To protect the woman he loved, he was having to tear down everything he had ever known. He had spent his life building a fortress, only to find the enemy was already inside. He left the study and climbed the stairs to the bedroom where Amara was staying. He opened the door quietly. The room was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the trees outside. Amara was tucked beneath the heavy duvet, her braids spread across the white pillow like silk. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake her. He looked at his hands, hands that had just cast out the last of his family, hands that were stained with the weight of his world. He felt like a man who was losing himself piece by piece. Amara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him sitting there and reached out, her warm hand finding his cold one in the dark. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. Taejin squeezed her hand, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. "The betrayal is over," he said. "But the war is just beginning. Go back to sleep, Amara. I'm not going anywhere." He stayed there long after she fell back into a peaceful slumber, guarding the only thing in his life that was still pure. He had cut out the rot, but he knew the Shin family wouldn't take the loss of their mole lightly. He had protected her tonight, but to truly keep her safe, he was going to have to do something he had avoided for a decade. He was going to have to stop hiding in the shadows and finally destroy the people who dared to threaten what was his. The sun had not yet risen over Seoul when Taejin returned to the command center of his safe house, but the city was already beginning to feel the tremors of his retaliation. He didn't need guns or masks for this stage of the conflict. He needed the crushing weight of the financial and legal systems he had spent a decade mastering. Taejin sat before a bank of monitors, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of scrolling data. Minho stood behind him, coordinating with a team of elite forensic accountants and black hat hackers hidden in decentralized locations across the city. The mission was clear: systematic erasure. Shin family's primary revenue comes from the Gyeonggi shipping ports and a network of offshore shell companies, Taejin said, his voice a low, steady cadence. "I want the port authorities to find every health and safety violation they've ignored for 20 years. I want their bank accounts in Singapore flagged for money laundering by dawn." For the next 24 hours, Taejin was a conductor of chaos. He didn't just attack the Shin syndicate, he dismantled the ground they stood on. By noon, The Shin family's primary construction contracts were revoked by the city, cited for structural irregularities that Taejin's team had quietly unearthed from old archives. By evening, the stock prices of their legitimate front companies plummeted as rumors of a massive tax evasion probe hit the wire. Taejin didn't eat or sleep. He moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency that even Minho found unnerving. Every time his eyes strained, he thought of Amara, of the way she had looked in that rain-slicked alley in Itaewon, surrounded by men who saw her only as a bargaining chip. That memory was the fuel that kept his focus sharp. Amara came down to the kitchen late that evening, finding Taejin staring at a screen that showed a cascading waterfall of red numbers, the real-time bankruptcy of his rivals. She placed a cup of coffee on the desk beside him, the scent of the roasted beans momentarily breaking through the sterile atmosphere of the room. "You look like you're fighting a war without moving a muscle," she said softly. Taejin didn't take his eyes off the screen, but he reached out and caught her hand, pulling her slightly closer. "In my world, the most effective kills are the ones that happen on a ledger. If I kill them with bullets, they become martyrs for their cause. If I take away their money, their influence, and their reputation, they become nothing. And nothing is exactly what I want them to be." Amara looked at the screen, then back at him. "Is it working?" "They've lost 40% of their liquid assets in 12 hours, Taejin replied. "By tomorrow, their allies will start turning on them. Rats don't stay on a sinking ship, and the Shins are currently under 10 feet of water." By the 48th hour, the pressure became unbearable for the opposition. The Shin Syndicate's elders, realizing that Taejin was prepared to burn down the entire sector just to spite them, withdrew their support. Shin Yona, who had stood so tall in the lobby of Jang Global in her crimson suit, was now trapped in a luxury villa that had been disconnected from the power grid and surrounded by legal injunctions. The final blow came on the morning of the third day. Taejin released a packet of encrypted files to the National Prosecutor's Office, evidence of the Shin family's involvement in the very murder of his father that he had been documenting for years. It was the nuclear option, a move that would permanently bar the Shin family from ever stepping foot in Seoul again without facing a life sentence. Minho entered the room, holding a tablet. "They're moving, sir." 3 black SUVs just left the Shin estate, heading toward Incheon International Airport. "Our sources say they've booked a private flight to a non-extradition territory in South America." Taejin finally leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "And Yona," she was in the second car, Minho said. "She looked different. She knows she lost." Taejin watched the GPS trackers move toward the coast. He had won. He had used the very system they tried to manipulate to cast them out. He had protected his empire, and more importantly, he had cleared the path for the woman who was currently upstairs, trying to make sense of a world that didn't follow the rules she knew. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the first light of the 73rd hour touch the horizon. The air in Seoul felt cleaner, the shadows a little less threatening. But as he looked at his reflection in the glass, he saw the cost of the victory. He had been ruthless. He had been the man everyone feared he was. He left the command center and found Amara in the garden of the safe house, watching the sunrise. She turned to him, her expression a mix of relief and a lingering, quiet sadness. "They're gone," Taejin said, stopping a few feet away from her. "For good?" she asked. "As long as I'm breathing, they won't come back," he promised. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to touch her braids. "The 14th floor is safe again. Your apartment is safe. You can have your life back, Amara." Amara looked at him, her honey-brown eyes searching his face. "Is that what you want? For me to just go back to being the intern who dropped her files?" Taejin felt a sharp pang of fear, a sensation more intense than anything he had felt during the War of Information. He had spent 3 days fighting to give her back her freedom, only to realize he couldn't bear the thought of her using it to walk away from him. "I want you to be whatever you want to be," he whispered. "But I'm not the same man I was when we met in that lobby. I don't think I can go back to the winter." Amara smiled, a small, radiant thing that made the 3 days of darkness worth it. She stepped into his space, her arms wrapping around his waist, resting her head against his chest. Good, because I forgot to bring a coat. Taejin held her tight, the warmth of her body a final, undeniable victory over the cold. The Shins were gone, his cousin was exiled, and the city was his. But as he held the girl from Chicago in the quiet of the morning, he knew that his greatest challenge was still ahead of him, learning how to live in the light he had fought so hard to keep. The glass and steel cathedral of Jang Global Industries was back to its usual rhythmic hum. It was Monday morning, and to the casual observer, the building was once again the pinnacle of corporate discipline. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere had shifted. The news of the Shin family's sudden departure from the country had spread like wildfire, and though no one dared speak it aloud, everyone knew the shadow sovereign had struck a killing blow. Amara stood in the center of the lobby, her heart racing as she smoothed down the fabric of her dress. She was no longer tucked away on the 14th floor. Today, she had arrived through the main entrance, not as a ghost, but as a woman who knew exactly where she stood. She carried no files, no heavy folders, and no fear. The elevators chimed, and a familiar silence swept over the room. Jang Taejin stepped out, flanked by Min-ho and a full security detail. He looked every bit the untouchable monarch, his black suit tailored to perfection, his stride commanding and precise. Every employee in the lobby stopped in their tracks, bowing their heads in a wave of practiced submission. Taejin didn't head for the private exit. He didn't look at the reception desk. His eyes were fixed on the girl standing in the middle of the marble floor. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. The lobby was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning felt like a roar. Amara looked up at him, her honey-brown eyes bright with a mixture of nerves and defiance. For 10 years, Taejin had avoided the gaze of every woman who sought his favor. He had treated the world like glass, but as he looked at Amara, he finally let the mask of the Ice King shatter in front of everyone he led. He didn't say a word. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that made the surrounding crowd gasp. Then, leaning down, he kissed her. It wasn't a hidden moment in the back of an armored car or a secret shared in a rooftop garden. It was a public declaration. It was the king of Seoul telling his empire that he had finally chosen. Amara melted into the kiss, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. In that moment, the hierarchy of Jang Global was rewritten. The intern from Chicago was no longer an outsider. She was the only person who truly held the sovereign's heart. When Taejin eventually pulled back, his eyes were soft, a rare and private warmth intended only for her. He kept his arm draped possessively around her waist as he turned to face the lobby. The message was clear. She was under his protection and her place was at his side. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice low and intimate. They walked toward the waiting sedan together, the security team forming a protective barrier that felt like an honor guard. For the first time in his life, Taejin felt a sense of genuine peace. The enemies were gone, the traitors were exiled, and the woman he loved was safe. 6 months later, that peace seemed as solid as the stone of his estate. It was a crisp evening, and Taejin stood on the balcony of his bedroom, a small velvet box heavy in his jacket pocket. Inside was a ring he had spent months designing, a flawless black diamond set in rose gold, a symbol of the beauty he had found in the shadows. Amara was inside, laughing at something on the television, her braids piled high on her head, looking more at home than he had ever thought possible. He was about to turn back inside when his personal phone, the one only 3 people had the number for, began to vibrate. It was a blocked number. Taejin frowned, his instinctual caution returning in an instant. He answered it, stepping further into the shadows of the balcony. "Congratulations on your victory, Taejin," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, sharp and cold as a winter wind. It was Yona. "I hear you've finally turned your lobby into a theater for your little romance." Taejin's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the railing. "You were told never to call this number. You are lucky to be alive, Yona. Don't push your luck from across the ocean." Yona's laugh was brittle and hollow. Oh, Taejin, you always were so focused on the present that you forgot to look at the past. Enjoy your happiness while it lasts. Because I found something. While I was cleaning out my father's private vault in Brazil, I found a series of ledgers he kept separate from the syndicate's business. I don't care about your father's debts, Taejin snapped. You will care about this, Yona whispered, her voice dripping with a newfound, poisonous confidence. You think you know why your father was murdered. You think my family was the only hand on the glass that night, but you're wrong. I found the payment records, Taejin. I found the names of the people who actually invited the poison into that room. And when you learn the truth, and you will, because I am sending the files to your personal terminal tonight, that girl you love so much, she's going to wish she never met you. What are you talking about? Taejin demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural growl. Ask yourself why a girl from Chicago with her specific family history was really granted a high-achievement scholarship to your specific firm, Taejin. Ask yourself who funded her father's medical bills 10 years ago, Yona said, her voice fatting as the signal began to break. The truth doesn't just melt ice, Sovereign. It burns everything to the ground. Goodbye, Taejin. I'll see you in the wreckage. Line went dead. Taejin stood in the darkness, the cold night air suddenly feeling like a blade against his skin. The ring box in his pocket felt like lead. He looked through the glass doors at Amara, who was now standing up, looking for him with a smile on her face. She looked so innocent, so bright, so far removed from the blood and the shadows, but the ice was already beginning to creep back into his chest. He thought of the files Yona mentioned, the secrets buried in the past, and the terrifying possibility that his father's death was linked to the very woman who had taught him how to live again. Taejin, Amara called out, stepping toward the balcony. Everything okay? Taejin forced his face into a mask of calm, but as he stepped back into the light to meet her, his hand stayed firmly over the phone in his pocket. The war wasn't over. The shadows were deeper than he had ever imagined, and the truth was coming for them both. Thank you for watching.